Hi, my name is Carl Pino, host of Janusian Economics. We explore economics and geopolitics in a rapidly changing multipolar world. To learn more, please like this video and subscribe to this channel.
We are told that your generation cares more than any other about one issue in particular, and that issue is climate change. We're told that many of you suffer from climate anxiety. What can we in Britain do? We can only do one thing. You know why? This country is responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, which means that if Britain was to sink into the sea right now, it would make absolutely no difference to the issue of climate change. You know why? Because the future of the climate is going to be decided in Asia and in Latin America by poor people who couldn't give a shit about saving the planet. You know why? Because they're poor. 120 million people in China do not have enough food. I don't mean that they don't get dessert, I mean they suffer from malnutrition. You're not going to get them to stay poor. Imagine you're Xi Jinping, the leader of China, and you know that the main thing you have to do to survive and to stay in power is to deliver the one thing that the people of China want: prosperity, economic growth. Where do you think climate change ranks on Xi Jinping's list of priorities? Now, if you said to me that I had a choice, either my son had a serious risk of starving or dying from a preventable disease in the next year, or I could press a button and he would live. But all I have to do is press this button, and for every day of my son's life, a giant plume of CO2 is going to get released into the atmosphere. Now, you're all very young, and most of you are not parents. Let me tell you something. There is not a parent in the world who would not smash that button so hard their hand bled. You are not going to get these people to stay poor. You're not even going to get them to not want to be richer. And so, I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, there is only one thing we can do in this country to stop climate change, and that is to make scientific and technological breakthroughs that will create the clean energy that is not only clean, but also cheap. And we on this side of the house are not on this side of the house because we do not wish to improve the world. We sit on this side of the house because we know that the way to improve the world is to work, is to create, it is to build.
Welcome to our third video in our energy policy series. The subtext of this video is for us to underscore and emphasize that the stakes of getting energy policy are very high because we are in the midst of a global economic war. One of our favorite contributors on energy policy, Doomberg, which is a collection of ex-energy executives and consultants that have moved into writing and doing podcasts and making some video log appearances. They like to say that energy is life, and of course this underscores the fact that all of our things that we consume in order to give us life in this world and to make our life meaningful requires energy. And particularly energy is used literally in the production of everything. We would use energy from heating our homes to making our television sets to keeping our food cool for transportation, for building, and so oil is the master commodity, if you will, that goes into the production of everything. And we showed you in a previous video the importance more broadly of hydrocarbon energy. Particularly, we put up a visualization on Germany which showed that $27 billion of cheap pipeline gas coming through the Nord Stream pipeline system to Germany supported half of the German economy, about $2 trillion worth of the German economy. So our agenda. We want to point out that in our view, we're entering a new Cold War. We want to ask ourselves, what is the goal of energy policy? We want to point out the importance of the investment in future energy technologies to help relax constraints on our energy side, and we want to discuss the monetary aspects of energy policy. So, to begin with, we had 2022 was a signature year where we had a lot of unusual things happening, but it came in the wake of course, 2 years of the world being responding to a global pandemic, which themselves were unique events. But one of them that didn't perhaps get as much attention as it should have was the destruction of the Nord 1 and Nord 2 pipelines. Nord 2 was a symbol of post-Cold War globalization, where two blocks of global power, former communist states versus capitalist states, could finally reconcile. The destruction of that pipeline symbolizes the end of post-Cold War peace and economic integration. And so we're basically, Europe and Russia are getting a divorce with respect to globalization. The global model of the West is that we own intellectual property, we provide services, and we are financialized here, and we consume cheap goods. And the global South then provides us with the steady supply of those cheap goods. Now, the global South wants a new deal. We're going to give you some excerpts from that Vladimir Putin has given on his belief that the world should be transitioning to a multipolar world away from a U.S. Western-dominated hegemony, where U.S. is at a unipolar leadership role. This is a quote from a speech that Putin gave in Moscow on October 2022. The conflict potential in the world as a whole, as well as at the regional level, remains high. New risks and challenges for collective security are emerging. This is a consequence of a sharp aggravation of the global geopolitical confrontation. Literally before our eyes, the world is changing and indeed becoming multipolar. Additionally, in a speech that Putin made at the BRICS summit in September 2022, he said the following: "It's important to maintain and boost mutually respectful, constructive, and effective cooperation globally, as well as to strengthen the emerging multipolar world order that consists of independent centers of economic growth and political influence, which certainly includes the BRICS." Putin is asserting in this quote that the world is governed by the Washington Consensus, and democracy should be replaced by a world that is where each country has more autonomy to pursue what it views as its own independent growth path. As a result, what we're seeing is that the world is bifurcating into a BRICS versus Global North and OECD. Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Turks are joining the BRICS, and the economic bloc is expanding. And we can look no further to the difference in the way that Saudi Arabia received the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, where the father went out to, MBS's father went out to meet Xi at the airport, and whereas Biden received a perfunctory and somewhat lackadaisical fist pump from MBS. Drawing this back to energy security, what we're seeing now is a bifurcation in terms of economic blocks in the world. Now, in order to preserve our standard of living, we can no longer rely on the global supply of chain of goods and energy the way that we were previously doing. So again, food and shelter are the foundation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for the human experience. And energy plays a crucial role in the production of both. And we have the conundrum here in the West that we consume 45 million barrels of oil a day while we only produce 30 million barrels a day. If our goals are ultimately to reindustrialize our economies and decouple from our dependency on China and the global South, then we must pursue a policy of having energy security in the West. This fact, of course, has become increasingly noted in both private and public sector thought pieces over the past year. And there's become an increasing recognition in various forms of media that we're at a transition point. And so we're going to cite a couple and quote a couple of examples. So the first example I'd like to quote is from Zoltan Pozsar. He is a top macro analyst, a former Federal Reserve Treasury official, who now works for Credit Suisse. On January 6th of this year, he wrote an article titled War and Peace. And I'm going to give you a quote from that article. In 2022, Pippa Malmgren became my source of macro stimulus. Her meme that World War III is already started, but it's different from traditional world wars. It is a hot war in cold places, and a cold war in hot places, inspired me to write 4 war dispatches last year. War and interest rates, war and industrial policy, war and commodity encumbrance, and finally, war and currency statecraft. In these, I identified 6 fronts, meaning hot wars in macro land, a cold place where great powers were going at it in 2022. The G7's financial blockade of Russia, Russia's energy blockade of the EU, the US's technological blockade of China, China's naval blockade of Taiwan, the US's blockade of EU's EV sector with the Inflation Reduction Act, and China's pincer movement around all of OPEC Plus with the growing trend of invoicing oil and gas sales in renminbi. Those were 6 geopolitical events in one single year. That is a geopolitical curveball to deal with every 2 months. So Zoltan is saying that there's a lot of transitioning going on in the global macrosphere, and it's around essentially a war that has started between the West and the global South. Now, the second quote I'd like to deliver today is from Ted Norhaus, writing for Foreign Policy on June 5th of last year. The article is titled, Russia's War is the End of Climate Policy as We Know It. And what I'm citing here are the last 2 paragraphs of the article. If recent months have demonstrated anything, it is that war, insecurity, and economic crisis are merciless teachers. Climate advocates and their political allies have often engaged in the policy equivalent of smoking one's own supply. They have confused the subsidy-driven growth of renewable energy with evidence that the world is ready to rapidly transition off fossil fuels. Hence, they discourage the production of oil and gas wherever they could, and chronically underinvested in other sources of clean energy, such as nuclear power. But while there has been technological progress, the global economy is still very far away from fully replacing fossil fuels. The confluence of war in Europe with a global energy security crisis reminds us that the West is not so different from the rest of the world. For better or worse, energy development and security remain the coin of the realm. Any global strategy to build a bulwark against ethno-nationalist authoritarianism, achieve economic stability and transition toward a low-carbon future will need to accommodate itself to that reality. We've underestimated the need that we have for traditional sources of energy, overestimated the speed and ability of renewable energy to replace those traditional sources. And if we're going to fight against authoritarian leadership all over the world, then we are going to, of course, have to develop our own supply of traditional energy sources, including nuclear, to be able to develop low-cost energy and provide a foundation for our own economic future as we are, in effect, deglobalizing. So what are the pillars of an energy policy that we would need to have in the West? Well, of course, coming back to the fact that energy is life and foundational to our economic well-being is cheap energy sources to provide us with food and shelter, then we need to have energy security at the heart of any kind of economic security plan that we will have going forward. Energy security needs to be more than just energy security for ourselves, but those of us who can provide more energy security for our allies who don't necessarily have the same energy resources, we need to do so. So we need to make sure that we're doing our part as good neighbors and partners to be able to help provide energy security to our allies. Of course, we have to balance that energy security with climate risks. One is a longer-term problem and one is an immediate problem. If we don't deal with energy security, what we're going to see happening is we will have a dramatic rise in energy costs and inflation in our societies, and that will be politically destabilizing, and then the climate agenda will get completely thrown out the window because of a populist backlash. So we need to find a balance that allows us to address both those issues, with the climate risk issue being a longer-term transition. And as part of addressing that longer-term transition, we need to invest in future technologies that are going to address both of those issues, hopefully in one way or another, both the energy scarcity and the climate risks. Energy security is at the forefront of national security. There's a person who named Luke Gromen, who Michael and I follow quite a bit of his videos that he does on YouTube, and he likes to say that energy is nature's discount rate.
Okay. Density is a great way of framing it, right? And ultimately, you've seen me probably say on Twitter before and in interviews that energy is the master resource, right? So we're watching this real time in Europe, which is, I think Zoltan Pozsar said the other day that $2 trillion in German value added is dependent on 20 billion in Russian gas. And so if you really, that 20 billion in Russian gas in that example is just nature's discount rate, right? The Fed can say, hey, we're going to lower rates, or the ECB can lower it. Nature doesn't give a shit. Like if the gas is going up in price, the discount rate of all assets, the discount rate on all assets is going up if the cost of energy goes up. And as that happens, the value of assets comes down. And the problem is, if we were an equity-based society, in other words, we didn't have all this debt, it was all equity-based, it wouldn't be a big deal. People write down their equity and we move on. It is what it is. But the challenge in a system that is a debt-backed system, debt-backed currency, is when you start writing down the value of assets, you're writing down the value of collateral against an extremely high debt load. You quickly get upside down. It has these broad-ranging macro implications that are, to put it mildly, problematic.
And so if you think about it, because we use energy in the production of everything that we that gives us life, then the cost of that energy effectively becomes our opportunity cost to society of providing those things. It's our discount rate, the same way that an interest rate represents the discount rate or the cost of borrowing and producing a borrowing debt. Energy, of course, is a main input into the production of manufactured goods. And as we are looking at transitioning towards producing more and more stuff here in the West to get away from our reliance on Russia and China, that means that energy costs are going to drive the cost of everything that we produce. Now, we've got another problem that we've gone through in the West. We have a very high level of an indebtedness in Western economies. The U.S. has over 120% debt to GDP. Canada has over 130% debt to GDP. Europe similarly has large indebtedness issues. And so if we end up having an energy crisis where energy prices spike and create what we would call a cost push inflation cycle, those energy prices are going to potentially trigger a debt crisis for us, where the central bank won't be able to get inflation under control. And because inflation is rising, then we're going to end up with having high inflation, and we'll have what, in effect, especially this is true if you're an energy importer like the UK, Germany, or Japan or Korea, you could end up with what we would call a traditional balance of payments crisis, because you need to consume it, and as it gets more expensive, both as a result of a higher US dollar or as a result of an energy shortage, because we're cut off from large energy producers in the world, this just is like adding another pound of debt, because you have this energy deficit that you need to make up to maintain your economy every year. Now, of course, Canada is one of the top 10 exporters of oil in the world. And so from the Canadian perspective, we know we have a large geographic size country with only 40 million people, and we produce lots of food and lots of energy. So you might say, well, there's no problem. And then, of course, also the United States itself has become a net exporter of energy in the last few years due to the growth of shale over time. Well, the problem is, of course, fundamentally is not just that Canada and the United States are okay because we're basically net exporters or self-sufficient on energy. The problem is that we're part of a group of Western allies that includes South Korea, Japan, the European Union. These are our allies that part of our NATO system that are net energy importers. And so when we get back to this concept once again that the West consumes 45 million barrels of oil a day, but produces only 30, those members of the Western Alliance that can produce more energy have a debt, a political debt, to do their best to produce that energy for the sake of the alliance, to be able to help supply stable energy for our allies. Otherwise, of course, we can't be guaranteed that they're going to remain allies. They may push themselves towards becoming more neutral or even move over toward the global south if we don't help them supply their basic energy commitments. And so we can see that historically, if we look at the U.S. foreign policy for much of the last 30, 40 years, especially since the establishment of the petrodollar, as we talked about in the early 70s when the United States went off the gold standard, keeping the U.S. dollar relatively stable in terms of how many barrels of oil it can provide has been a major foreign policy goal of the United States. And if we don't continue to do so, what we can expect is that we could see the collapse of the global monetary system as we know it, because you might see European countries have to go to Russia and say, okay, let's enter into a bilateral arrangement. We're going to stop trading in U.S. dollar. I'll give you pound, and I'll give you rubles for your oil, and we could see the whole Western order petrodollar system collapse on itself if we don't move towards supporting it. Our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, has discussed the fact that we are now forging new trade alliances with our friendly neighbors, where we're going to, this concept now that's come out in the last year is what's called friendshoring. We're going to be transitioning our supply chain away from autocracies towards democracies that are part of our alliance.
Today, I want to lay out the new economic path that the world's democracies should chart together. The past 33 years were guided by an idealism that was both high-minded and, for the countries of the Transatlantic Alliance, supremely comfortable. We were fat and happy. The curse of oil is real, and so is the dependence of many of the world's democracies on the world's petro-tyrants. Friendshoring can both defend liberal democracy and help to preserve the planet if one of our objectives is to speed up the green transition.
Well, this is a pipe dream if we don't do our part to supply those members of the alliance with a guaranteed stable energy supply. And that specifically, of course, in our case would mean that we have to supply Japan, South Korea, and the European Union with cheap energy so they can maintain their prosperity and be a cost-effective place for us to friendshore, to transition our production away from, China specifically, of course, in the main, but also from other countries as well. So what should the West do now? Well, we have to recognize that there are limitations currently of what we would call net zero or environmentally carbon-free technologies. Because we can't replace everything with renewable energy or net zero energy, new sources of energy, we're going to have to find cost-effective, reliable hydrocarbon energy that will provide a stopgap for us, because the transition to clean energy solutions is not going to happen in 5 years, 10 years. It's going to be decades in the making. And of course, to have that transition happen, we're going to have to look at various technology improvements that what we might call moonshot technology improvements that would allow us innovations that would allow us to transition away from hydrocarbon energy. So we have to do a full court press for investing in new technologies and supporting new technologies that over time will be able to supplant hydrocarbon energy. But we're not in a world where we can make that transition realistically now in 5 or 10 years. So we've identified the following limitations in previous videos of a transition to electrification and clean energy technologies. Right now we have inadequacy of our grid structure. So our grid structure is antiquated. And because wind speeds can vary, you either then the electricity system needs to be balanced on a moment-by-moment basis. You have only a certain amount of electricity that can move through your transmission wires. So you can either build that for overcapacity to say have reached the maximum that wind and solar could produce, or you're going to have to do something called curtailment. You're going to have to, when there's more wind and solar energy being produced than the transmission capacity that you built has, then the system operator would essentially take some of that power, some of that generation off the system and curtail it. We would have to double the capacity of the electricity grid. And the transmission grid is extremely expensive. Nobody wants transmission wires in their backyard. You need, because renewable resources are often in remote locations, you would ideally need to have some high voltage electricity being built. And the grid system is old. Secondly, there's a shortage of clean energy minerals. We talked about this in a previous video. We have a complete lack of rare minerals that are needed for the production of electric vehicles. And there's about 10 of them. So we've got copper, graphite, nickel, silicon, zinc, chromium, magnesium, lithium, and molybdenum. The existing stock that we have versus our estimate of 2030, we need to either a doubling or as much as 17 times in terms of graphite increase in production. And one could argue, well, prices will save us and production increases will happen rapidly. Well, there's never been a case in a decade that production has increased in any mineral more than 100% in the space of a decade. So if we continue to have an ever-increasing demand for energy as our economy grows, then we're going to and we can't fill it with clean tech right now. Then we're going to have to fill in the gap using traditional energy sources, and that brings us now. Of course, we could talk about the question of nuclear. But nuclear itself is a problem. Bill Gates has funded, and I'm going to mention this, talk about this as a point in a few minutes, but the potential to do small nuclear reactors. There was going to be one that was going to be done in Wyoming, and that's been delayed for 2 years because Russia actually produces 50% of the nuclear rods that get processed in the world. So even on nuclear, which Michael and I are both extremely supportive of the broader development of nuclear, right now, again, Russia is a choke point for that. So again, it would be something that we would potentially, with our nuclear resources in Canada, we would want to develop, perhaps with our Canadian uranium, more processing capability here in Canada. But if we can't do nuclear because those timelines are longer and we need something to provide a quicker stopgap and prevent an energy crisis, then we've got essentially in the West 3 options that are available to us in terms of expanding hydrocarbons. So we can expand hydrocarbons through Canada, the United States, or Venezuela. Now, if we look at the U.S., what we've seen is, and we've talked about this before, that there was a revolution in hydraulic fracturing technology in the shale industry that allowed the U.S. to access light oil that was trapped within rock formations. And in those 3 basins, that 2 are in Texas, one in East Texas, Eagle Ford, one in West Texas, Permian, and then the North Dakota basin called the Bakken. That production, there are quite a bit of reserves in those areas. And Zoltan Pozsar, who I referenced earlier, the macro analyst for Credit Suisse, he suggested that the U.S. needs to think about nationalizing its shale industry in order to pivot back towards having a greater U.S. Oil production. And but as we've noted and shown you in previous graphs, it looks like the U.S. shale has reached its past productivity peak. Now in Canada, if we count our reserves of what we call unconventional reserves, which are those types of reserves that are held in the oil sands, we have the world's second largest known reserves. And but we've had a world where political policies have impeded the development of our energy resources in Alberta. We've had political pressures that particularly that have prevented us from building cheap oil transportation infrastructure. So, for example, the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, which was eventually sold by Kinder Morgan to the federal government, it was originally budgeted at $4.5 billion, but now looks like it's going to come in at a cost of $19 billion. So we've had massive cost overruns. Now, Venezuelan production has fallen from about 3.5 million barrels a day in 2014 to under 1 million barrels a day of export production. And basically, you've had a humanitarian disaster in Venezuela. I think one time around 2017, there was a food starvation in Venezuela, and the average Venezuelan lost 20 pounds in a year because of the level of poverty that happened. The Biden administration is looking through, starting out with Chevron, to reach out to Venezuela and restarting production. But that's a process that's going to take quite a bit of time to get going. Venezuela, because of the lack of taking care of its oil fields, they've currently they've got an environmental disaster in terms of the condition of their oil fields, and so they're not the best source of energy. Canada would still be, I think, the best bet for increasing oil production in the West, if we could get our coordination going. So what then should the West do with respect to energy policy? Well, the only production that can reliably scale without major political unrest is Canada. And of course, as in Canada, we are heavily influenced by what the United States wants, because we are a strong ally of the United States, and we benefit greatly from being next to the United States. So we tend to accommodate their wishes. So if the U.S. administration would want to have an increase in production, it's likely that we would do that to accommodate our Western allies. So if we were going to do something like that, how might we do it in Canada? We would need investment tax credits for oil production. This was done by Chrystia and Martin in the 1990s. We would have to subsidize oil infrastructure, pipelines, and if we built an upgrader would allow us to do some refining closer to the oil sands production sites. Mass funding for carbon capture and storage, so that would help us be able to deal with the climate issues around increased carbon production. Some of that's already happening, and the Prime Minister is asking the Alberta government to use some of the money from its budget surplus that it has now that energy prices are high, and also become a partner in investing in carbon capture and storage. And in terms of climate change strategies, it's clear that we're going to blow past our 2050 targets for CO2. And since that's going to happen because we're not willing to make the consumption cuts that would be required to reduce CO2 as part of the population, then what we need to do is then focus on mitigation strategies for dealing with higher temperatures that are coming. So we should be installing air conditioners. We should do things like stop building on floodplains, because most of the costs of climate change to us right now are that we continue to build on floodplains. We should build levees. So we should do things to start to prepare for the fact that for the things that are coming in climate change, and those are more realistic than the restrictive demand that we would need to be able to constrain our CO2. In the West, for instance, we would need to not do a short-haul flight more than once every 3 years. This has been in a report issued by the IPCC, and not do a long-haul flight more than once every 8 years. So that kind of consumption restriction is not realistic in terms of us being able to reduce our CO2. As well, of course, if we are effectively engaging in war with Russia and China, and we're not going to be willing to pay for India to, in terms of its CO2 reduction, any reductions we do here are not likely to amount to much on a practical point. So our monies would be better spent in terms of addressing mitigation strategies. So we're on our way to overshooting our 1.5 Celsius climate change commitment. And what we need to think about in terms of being able to address that in the future, since the political will for demand constraint is not likely there in democracies, is to come up with a technological breakthrough. So we should be doing massive financial commitment into research and development for clean technology that would allow us to transition away from hydrocarbons cost effectively. We've noted that there is some that while CO2 production in the world is still going up, we're still consuming more coal. We are seeing some increase in investment in clean tech. That's a positive. Some of the solutions that may come in the future in terms of these big technological breakthroughs are, for example, a molten salt battery technology, fusion, direct air carbon capture, solid state lithium ion batteries, and these small self-contained nuclear reactors. These are examples of technologies that we could have in the future that could help us dramatically reduce our dependence on hydrocarbons. But we're not there yet. There are some things to become hopeful about. The U.S. has become the world's largest exporter of LNG. In Canada, here in Alberta, we've made a major oil discovery in the Clearwater area, and it's the cheapest place for producing new oil in North America, so that's a positive. The United States last year passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which was targeted at helping the U.S. economy develop and transition towards cleaner energy, and there's $65 billion set aside for upgrading the U.S. Electricity grid. Now, there's a monetary aspect of energy that we need to consider. And again, there was an important visit by China's Xi Jinping last year to Saudi Arabia, and they came and had up with a comprehensive new trade agreement. And the elements of that trade agreement include that they're going to cooperate on clean tech manufacturing. There's going to be infrastructure investment in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is going to build out a petrochemical complex in China, and they are going to settle their trade balances in the renminbi, or the Chinese currency, renminbi or yuan. This part about the settlement of the trade balance in renminbi isn't well understood in the West. Basically, China is a huge net energy importer, and therefore it needs U.S. dollars, and it wants to get away from its reliance on U.S. dollars, and so it wants to undermine the petrodollar system. And so what we're seeing is countries that want to move away from reliance on the U.S. dollar are looking at ways of transacting in their own currency, and China is really paving the way for this. China started to buy energy from Russia in renminbi, and Saudi Arabia will probably do the same. And they are going to be able to settle, they're looking at being able to settle the trade imbalances that they may have in gold, and that will be off the Shanghai Exchange in the next few years. And that's going to be the topic of our next video, is the role of gold coming back as a monetary asset. I want to close out our video by using a quote from Tolstoy that Zoltan Pozsar cited in his War and Peace article. It's worth repeating here, I think, because it represents the modern dilemma we're facing as a society. The most difficult subjects can be explained to the most slow-witted man if he has not formed any idea of them already. But the simplest thing cannot be made clear to the most intelligent man if he is firmly persuaded that he knows already, without a shadow of a doubt, what is laid before him. We've been very used to, in the West, cheap energy. We have been very used to declining energy costs for the last 20 years. And like anything else that happens over a period of time, we begin to feel like we have an entitlement towards it. And we don't want to acknowledge that the world may be transitioning and that era may be coming to an end. But I want to look you in the eye now, or tell you in all seriousness, we're effectively entered into a war, the West with the global South, and the era of cheap energy is over. And we need to accept that reality and become more self-reliant in the West. We need to have adult conversations about energy policy that includes hydrocarbons and a realistic timeline to transition away from them. Our upcoming videos are going to be talking about gold as a monetary asset coming back, and South Korea as potentially a field for the next proxy war. So those are the videos that we're going to be making in the future. Bye for now, Genusians. I hope this finds you well, and I hope to see you soon. Please like this video and share it with all those who you think could find it useful. Take care.